you guys thumbnails and then work in the chat. Well, good morning, everybody. As always, I tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I tell you what I told you. So we'll go through the I tell you what I'm going to tell you part first, the agenda. So we'll go over, I thought we'd spend 10, 15, maybe even more minutes on my vast qualifications as a biblical scholar, and then turn to the best approach for Bible study. We'll study a passage. So if you guys have a Bible at home, if you want to turn to Romans 1:1 in whatever Bible you have, that would be great. And we'll do a very short study of Romans 8:35, but just turn to 1:1 in your Bible. That'll be
big red one in this. You'll see it, the big red one in the family room.
So we'll do that. We'll just study a passage. Then we'll just do a studying Paul's letters. You know, since they make up about half of the Old Testament, we'll just talk about them and different approaches. Then I'll tell you what I told you. So that's what we'll do. Okay. So, you know, just if you want to use the chat, use the chat. I'm not great at looking out for hands, but I will try my best. All right. I know there's who are anxious to dispute my qualifications. So here we go. First, as I said, we'll spend about 15 minutes about my qualifications as a biblical scholar. Okay. Are there any questions? I have none. All right. So this is just me. I'm on a voyage with you guys, a venture. So I didn't really start Bible study until I joined Jane Hoover's class at St. Stephen's in the adult forum that John so ably runs. So that's it. Those are my complete qualifications. All right.
But Mike, I thought Yale would teach you something.
Well, I did get a cup. So that's about it. No, I didn't take any religious courses at college. None. Zero. So they didn't help. All right. So let's I am a big fan of this guy, Walter Taylor, who wrote this book, Paul, Apostle of the Nations. I think he's at least he resounds with me. And he talks about the best approach, and he says that's the one that keeps you studying the Bible. So whatever works for you, you know, if videos work for you, if group study works for you, if getting the commentary works for you, if all those work for you, that's the best way. That's the best approach for Bible study. And one of the we use the Kerygma curriculum at Monday Night Bible Study most of the time, except when they don't have one about one of the books we're studying. And here's the best quote I ever got from one of the Kerygma instructors. He said, Bible study is like real estate. There's three important factors, and everybody knows real estate, right? Location, location, location. They talk about, right? So he said Bible study is context, context, context. That was his idea. So always try to remember the context. All right. So let's take a passage, Romans 1:1, in your Bible. Now I'm just so everyone knows, I'm using my HarperCollins Study Bible. All right. So that's the NRSV. And I'm going to turn to 1:1, and I'm not great at screenshots and all that other stuff. So I just typed what I see in my Bible. All right. So it starts off with the letter of Paul to the Romans on the and you can on the big print here, letter of Paul to the Romans. I've highlighted it in yellow. We'll go over those reasons why I highlighted some in yellow. Then it says salutation right above 1:1. And then we see 1:1, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. Now, Paul didn't actually write the stuff in yellow. All right. Paul started to write everything that is in white, or, you know, it's not highlighted, whatever you want to call it. So his letter actually started with Paul. All right. Anybody know what the yellowish, the highlighted stuff is called? Paratext. All right. So that's text that's inserted by the editor of the translation. And Paul didn't start with 1:1. All right, and then go 1:2, 1:3, 1:4. All right, so that was started. Chapters and verses were started by printers, right? Because printers wanted to be able to cut off at the right place and put the pages. So that dates from 1205 and 1551, our current divisions into chapters and verses. So when you see chapters and verses and you see headings here, Paul didn't write that. All right, Paul didn't start with 1:1 and then go to chapter 2. And he just wrote a letter to the Romans. All right, and sometimes you'll get different chapter headings. You'll often get different chapter headings here. Salutation. Some will call that opening. Depending on your translation. I have 3 translations for our Bible study, but there's many translations. Okay. So the one I used, as I said, is the New Revised Standard Version. That's a translation. Remember that for some reason, the ancient Hebrews did not write it in English. They wrote the Bible in Hebrew, and there's a little bit of Aramaic is what now I don't speak either one, so you have to take this stuff on faith. So if they said it was written in Aramaic, that's good enough for me. All right. The New Testament, of course, was written in Greek. All right, which I also don't speak. Translation is tricky, and everyone speak another language at least a little bit. If you don't, we'll go over about speak. So if you went to a party and you hear a bunch of Italians and they're saying "cento questi giorni," right? And so if you don't speak Italian, you'd say to the person, "What are they saying?" And the person who speaks Italian has 3 choices, basically. So the translator could say 100 these days, which is what? That's a literal translation. 100, cento, questi, these days. You hear people say buongiorno, good morning, good day, actually. And so giorni is the plural of day, so that's days. So 100 these days is a literal translation. If the translator knew that you were an English teacher, he would add, because we don't say that in English, right? They would say 100 of these days, trying to give you a more Englishy sounding translation. Or they would say, they're saying happy birthday, which is what? That's the meaning, right? Because we don't, if it's Susan Heimovich's birthday today, right? So none of us are going to say 100 of these days to Susan, right? You just don't do that in English. What you're going to say is happy birthday, but that is not 100 of these days. So, before I went to Saudi, they gave us a 1-week course in Arabic. And, if you're saying good morning in Arabic, you say sabah khair, which means morning the good. So that's kind of close to good morning, but the response is sabah nur, which is morning the light, right? Which we don't, if somebody said, what did he say? Is that you're not going to say morning the light, because right? You're going to say they said good morning. So there's the literal, and then there's the message part. So on translations, I stole this from the internet. You can see here's the NRSV, is thought for thought, as opposed to word for word. So 100 these days would be more of a word for word. So you can see all these abbreviations. There's probably 200 more versions of translations that are not listed, but the NRSV is here. Now I do have the Message, which is a complete paraphrase basically, but the Message, I think sometimes it's really interesting what the paraphrase is. So you can see there's a continuum from the word for word over to the paraphrase. So always be aware that, and just as always, the close connection between Bible study and football officiating is these translators make a call. All right. So when they look at this, they're making calls, and the translators are making calls continually on what they're going to translate. We have to keep that in mind. Okay. All right. So we'll start with, as I said, this Dr. Taylor's perspective. So this is what it says in my NRSV Bible, Romans 1:1. Again, there's the quote. Happy birthday, Susan.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Getting older.
So part of the paratext here is this footnote, right? So we see Paul, a servant, and then we have footnote A. And it says GK slave. Now they do this just to confuse us. All right, so what do you think this means?
Greek, it would be translated slave.
Correct. That's right. So in the original Greek language, the primary meaning of that word is slave. So this is Dr. Taylor's idea that a servant to our ears, right? The modern North American 21st century people is someone who chose to be in a position, right, of service. So you could be a butler, you could be a public servant, right? We call that. So he says, to this translator, is that what Paul meant? Did Paul mean he was voluntary or not? And in Dr. Taylor's view, he doesn't like the translation because he says that Paul wants to indicate that his relationship to Jesus is that of a slave and Jesus is his master. So we have a difference of translation by this commentator on the NRSV. So these are all calls that these translators are making over and over again. And I think that's something to, in our Bible study, we're constantly saying, what's your translation saying? What's your trend? And you get different shades of the same word, which always fascinates me for unknown reasons. It may not fascinate you, but it fascinates me. So he says to look at first the translation perspective, then he talks about the historical perspective. So again, we have the quote from 1:1, and he said, let's look at this historically. So who is Paul? So we have to know who the author is, right? How do we, in any history, right? You're looking at sources. If you're a historian, you're big on footnotes and you're big on citations. So, what are our sources that we're looking at? Who is Paul? So we have these letters and attributed to Paul, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And then what else do we have about Paul?
We have the Acts of the Apostles.
The Acts of the Apostles, right? Which really ought to be called the Acts of Paul, or Paul and others, maybe. So the book of Acts. Plus we have our knowledge, right, of history from the surviving histories of the time, right? Especially Josephus is often used, who was a historian around the change from BC to AD, or BCE to CE as they call it. So let's ask a basic question. So is Paul married?
I don't think so.
You don't think so, says Betty. All right. And how do you know, Betty? Because you weren't invited to the wedding.
That's right. That's right. I wasn't invited to the wedding. He really doesn't have a high regard for women, in my opinion. And he seems to be traveling alone. There's something wrong with him, which we don't know what it is.
Okay.
But I don't
I
think
would, I would say
Paul
we,
traveled with an entourage, and in that entourage were a group of women.
Right. Prissa, right?
Right.
Right, was one of them, right? So we have that. So we have, again, we have to look at stuff, right? Scott, you have your hand raised. Very good.
A historian.
that's a big dispute, right? Because in one of the verses he says, "I wish that you would all remain even as I," okay, which implied he was not married. Okay, yet it's very weird to have a Jew of that age not married, and so there's like you say, it's a big discussion, right? And who knows what it means.
Right. So there's endless fascination with this, right, Betty?
it's also interesting that Jesus was not married, as far as we know, and he was of an age he should have been.
Right. So all this stuff. So and in your question or your comment, you're saying that, you're trying to get all the pieces together. So here's let's build a case. So in Philippians, which is attributed to Paul, it says, "As to the law of Pharisee," right? So we know that this was one of the parties in at that time, and based on our knowledge of history that survives, that Pharisee males were pretty much married in their teens. So he says he's a Pharisee, and Pharisees were usually married. However, and Scott already, he ruined the surprise. In 1 Corinthians, he talks about this. He's talking about marriage. He says, "I wish that all were as I myself am." And the idea of that is that he's wishing that everyone was single, right? So here's Dr. Taylor's view of this. Now, of course, he doesn't call touchdown or no catch. He calls both kind of. He says when he wrote 1 Corinthians, he was not married. He's not saying he was never married here. Right? So he's taken kind of the middle course on this. But again, we could spend a couple of weeks on just, was Paul married? I think one of the things I like is to know a lot about a little rather than a little about a lot. So I tend to, Stephanie says, obsess about the minor details. So again, but this is the historical perspective. Let's look at history. Political perspective from the same verse, right? So if we're looking at this, we know that Rome, right, was the capital city of the empire. All right, one of the great powers on the face of the earth. So what do we get from that?
Well, Paul was a Roman citizen.
Paul was a Roman citizen, right? Because he says he was, and that has implications later on in his life, right?
We don't get that from this verse.
No, we don't get that from this verse. But we know he's writing to the people in Rome, right? Because he says he is, right from this verse.
We know he's not in Rome.
We know he's not in Rome, right? What else? If you're a remember they used to call this Kremlinologist, and they would go over Pravda and TASS press reports with a fine-tooth comb. So this is how Paul is starting this, and he's writing to the people in Rome, maybe to the church in Rome. So what else?
Maybe we have the fact that he identifies first and foremost as a bond slave of Jesus Christ.
Yes, and as as opposed to the emperor, maybe. So is this undercutting the emperor? Is this what Paul means? I'm a slave of Jesus, not whichever like Claudius or Nero or whichever one happened to be in power. Is that what he's saying?
That's a good point, Mike. And what we learn is that the kerygma is that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar is Lord, not Kaiser Kyrios, but Jesus Kyrios. And that was the problem that the early church had with the Roman leadership.
Correct. And so is this the start of that problem when if you're one of the I don't know, the press secretary to Nero or whatever you would be, are you, hey boss, look at this I got a copy of this letter, and this Paul is saying that he's a slave of someone called Jesus Christ and not you. Now, of course, sometimes we read into this, right? Maybe we're overlaying our political perspective onto what Paul is writing, but it's interesting. At least I find this all fascinating. So I'm going to keep saying it's interesting, and maybe you guys are saying that. Next slide, please. But so it's something to think about, right? There's a political perspective, which always fascinates me. And it's a little discourse. We'll go to Romans 8:35. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? And this is a political, whenever I think of Romans, I think of the politics. So what do we have here? What's this picture tell us? Any
Royalty.
Royalty, okay. Royalty, good. Any military buffs here? What regiment?
Here.
Excuse me?
He was a pilot, wasn't he?
Yeah, we know that he's a pilot because he's got his wings on, right?
Yeah.
His RAF wings, right? And what's this guy tell you? He's a guardsman, right? The Brigade of Guards, because they're the only ones who wear scarlet tunics like this, right? And he's got buttons by 4. It's not a hint. And he's got a shamrock on his collar. He's got green on his cap.
Maybe he's an Irish guard.
Irish guard. An Irish guard. He's a corporal, right? We know that in the Irish Guards. And this is St. Patrick's Day last year, and they're handing out the shamrocks to the Irish Guards. Okay. I don't know who this woman is. I've never seen her before. And if you look really close at their cap badge, you'll see this. All right. And anybody know what that is? What the words are? How about my Latin people? Anybody else take Latin in high school?
I did, but
Okay.
I did, but
Qui qui quad. Remember who? Who?
yeah.
Qui quad. We just
Who's,
bring bad memories of Latin.
oh yeah, 4
Okay.
years of it.
And separabit, right? Future of separare, separare. No. Who will separate? So that's the Latin. Who will separate? This is the cap badge of the Irish Guards. So this is the Order of St. Patrick, which the Brits did. They never pass an opportunity to stick their thumbs in the eye of the Irish, right? So they use for the cap badge of the Irish Guards the start of Romans 8:35. Who will separate us? That's what quis separabit is. And it started in 1783. So this is they're using Romans to about the Irish. Who will separate us? And the answer, of course, is no one, right? In both Romans 8:35 and in the eyes of the British about the Irish. So we have even today you'll see remnants of the political perspective of Bible study. All right, and these are baskets of the shamrocks. So getting back to serious Bible study. All right, so now social scientific perspective, according to Dr. Taylor. social history of Rome and the world at the time Paul writes about, right? So we would ask, what does a slave, what are their roles? What are their functions? How did somebody become a slave? What would a Roman of the first century hear when Paul refers to himself as a slave of Jesus? What would that do? How do slaves fit in the social class theories of ancient Rome? And this is always one that I think is good to keep in mind about the New Testament. One of the core values, honor, shame, right? Honor, claim to worth and acknowledged by the public, all right? So shame, you lose that honor and loss of status. And the important thing is there's only a fixed amount of honor. So if I get some honor, I took it away from one of you or all of you. But the important thing is that I get it and you lose it. All right. So there's a fixed amount of honor. And so what would this statement by Paul do to his honor, to his shame? Things to ask about when we see something like this. And he talks about honor and shame in 1:16. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." So he kind of touches on that honor shame dichotomy in Romans. So here's rhetoric. Again, how do you persuade a listener in the given cultural setting? And we know about this from some of the sources of rhetoric. Anaximenes, I think he's my personal favorite. Cicero and Quintilian. I remember trying to translate Cicero in Latin. Man, was that tough. But so I don't know a lot, so I look at the commentators about this, and so. But if he calls himself a slave, as he does in this passage, how does that rhetorically come across? Was he trying to make bonds with slaves? Maybe including, remember, some of them had high positions of authority in the bureaucracy of Rome. Does it bring forth sympathy? Of course, then again, there's always dangers with this, right? We're projecting ourselves maybe into the exegesis of the chapter or the verse that we're going through. And literary, right? So the text, we're looking at the text. We don't care as much about the cultural content or so could this have been delivered by an abolitionist? Could John Brown have said this because he's disputing that he's really a slave of the emperor? Plot, movement, characters, the ideal reader, the discourse. So that's the literary perspective. We get the theological perspective, I think, which sometimes we think is the most important, but it's one of the most important. So here Paul says he's a slave of Jesus Christ. And that's a powerful theological statement, right? Who is Jesus Christ? Who does Paul think Jesus Christ is? Why is he the master? Right? If Paul's the slave, why is he the master? What does it mean when he says Jesus is Christ, right? Is a title, right? It's not Jesus's last name, right? It's Jesus the Christ. When you look at some of the Old Testament prophets, right? What does this mean? They've also said that they're servants, maybe / slaves of God. And so how does Paul fit in with Jesus, and how does Jesus fit in with Moses and Joshua and David and the other prophets? So that's the kind of the theological perspective.
And with Cyrus.
Yes, yeah, Cyrus, right. As we're learning about in Isaiah, another instrument of God, right? So, which one is the best? Anybody? Votes? We're gonna decide this by votes. Yes, Anthony.
I think we need to go back to what you said earlier, context. And in order to determine which one is best, each one has a context in which it is set in. And I'm not sure that we can adequately say which is the best, because we need to look at the geopolitical context.
Okay, good. Anybody else?
I think Mike Pasenelli's is the best.
Wait a second, Scott. The check was in the mail. So, here's the one I think is the best. I think it's good.
yeah.
I'm sitting right on the. I don't make a call, right? I just say all of it, right? So we have a personal foul on the offense and on the defense. The penalties offset. I replay the down. Okay, but no, I think whichever one helps you, and that's why I think, not making a shill for our Bible study or adult forum, but that's why these places, kind of this group context is good, because if you're studying, I think you tend to go down the familiar path, right? The path that you think, and then someone will say at adult forum like today, I think this, and wow, I never thought of that, and maybe your path, you go on both paths. So I think that's why I think groups like this are really important, and teach us well. Okay, so let's talk about Paul. We talked about Bible study in general, so let's talk about Paul. So, there's 13 letters attributed to him in the New Testament. And before I thought if something said that was written by somebody, that's it. But in the ancient times, there was a common phenomenon of writing in the name of someone who was more important than you are. And this is called pseudonymity, all right? From two Greek words, pseudo, false, and anoma, name. All right, so false name. That's what pseudonymity is. And so they have, again, I don't know anything about Greek, but supposedly Pythagoras, I remember his theorem, wrote a large number of works, but historians are convinced he never wrote anything at all. So all the works attributed to Pythagoras are pseudonymous, or pseudonymous, or however you say it. Okay, they're not really written by him. There's letters that say they were written by Plato that were written centuries after his death, not just a couple of years after his death, but centuries. So why would somebody write in Paul's name? Anybody? Why do we have these letters of Paul that supposedly were written by Paul, but scholars think weren't?
I think you hit on it when you said that they want. There are two things, in my opinion, that it could be. Okay, one is that they really, when you do something in the name of somebody else, you're doing what they want you to do. Okay, so there could be some things where it's from the school of Paul, or one of the guys who hung out with Paul and traveled around with Paul wrote such and such a letter, or it could be that, like I say, a school of Paul, that just sometime later and so on. And other things were written pseudonymously, and they were said, and they were intended to be persuasive and intend to carry the authority of the original writer, but probably not for the best reasons, though.
Right. To get in the New Testament. that's might be one, the good, looking on the spectrum of good to evil, right? The good thing would be I studied with Paul for 20 years, and I've listened to Paul, and these are really Paul's thoughts. But the bad thing is I just want this to get credibility. These are my ideas, maybe, but since I said they were from Paul, instant credibility is going to happen. Maybe, though, more on the good continuum, I'm going to update the things Paul said, because I know about Paul, and this is a new circumstance, or to a new audience, and I want to update what he said while he was alive, and he's gone now. But I'm going to write some thoughts that I know, because I was in that school of Paul. So these are some of the ideas.
Could I interject really at this time that, and also this is not it seems like a liberal conservative type of thing to discuss, but in another way, the early authors, this is right here, the book, Eusebius is talking about which letters were really written by Paul and what things should be included as scripture.
Right.
This is the guy who was responsible for the Nicene Creed. Okay.
Right.
So it's not a liberal conservative. In fact, the conservatives should be most concerned about it, because they want to know what really is in the Bible.
Right. Now, of course, the thing is that all these are in the Bible, right? I'm only discussing things that when you open your Bible, you're going to see that they're either attributed to Paul or historically were attributed to Paul. But this is always fascinating to me to delve into this, and how do they know? So they look at the vocabulary of the Greek, right? So for example, how does the author refer to the heavenly places or the heavens? So in some circumstances in Ephesians, we're talking about heavenly places. This term occurs nowhere else in the New Testament. Everywhere else in the letters, it's called the heavens. And I don't speak Greek, so I won't torture your ears with my pronunciation of these two phrases. But so this is, say, a clue, right? How do they say thank you? Is another word, another Greek term, karen echo or eucharisteo, I give thanks. Sometimes Paul used the word kyrios for the owner of slaves, but in 1 Timothy and Titus, he uses another word, right, that he never used in the other letters attributed to him. The way he uses the word faith in Greek. And sometimes it's faith in God or trust in God. Sometimes it seems to be specifically about what we would term now the Christian religion. There's other words, the beloved, commonwealth, and you can see that here, debauchery, my personal favorite. So these specific uses of vocabulary give and again, this is all from people way smarter than me. These are clues to whether the letters were written by the same author. All right. And again, these are all, yes, Scott.
One thing, there's to be careful about these things. There was what do they call those guys? Catholics. They call them Catholics. And he wrote in the Catholic Encyclopedia, this guy actually, this is like in the turn of the other century, the 1800 to 1900, somewhere in there. Yeah, they do these studies, and what you've just pointed out here. Yeah, he never uses this before. Okay, but using the same exact criterion, you could conclude that Shakespeare did not write Macbeth or the witches scene, because it's about the same number of words as one of these letters. Okay,
right.
Yet the purpose is different. You can't go too far. And this guy in the way back in the 1800s or 1900s. I can't remember which what century it was in, but the point is, he actually did the math on this and counted the words, and how many times Shakespeare uses these words and these words and these words, and came up with. So my point in saying this is that there might be other reasons, and these other letters like 2 Timothy and 1 Timothy and Titus may not be from Paul, but you got to be careful when you just throw these things around, like say, it's especially when they're hapax logomena, once used once in the New Testament, so.
Right. And this is not, I kind of look at this as, this is all stuff to process, right? To think about, it's not that this doesn't, especially since I don't speak Greek, this does not make the call for me, right? So you just have to be aware of this. And one of my favorite authors, Brueggemann, always says, hey, it's in the canon, we pay attention to it. That's his point. So I always think about that too, that these are all in the canon. So in style, again, this is, again, since we're at least one removed, right? When they say the language of Romans is terse, rapid, a lot of that is because of the translation we have, right? Ephesians, already saved, but Romans says salvation is clearly in the future. Sometimes we have mention of the Spirit, and again, you have to be careful with all of this. Titus, the author calls Jesus God. Paul doesn't seem to make that call in the undisputed letters. So here's kind of the now this is my this middle one is what I call 50-50, or in officiating, this is when in doubt, right? So in other words, scholars seem to be split on Colossians and 2 Thessalonians. These are you'll hear pillar letters. You look at commentaries, or undisputed letters is another term that everyone who knows anything says these were written by Paul. Then most say Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus were not written by Paul. Most say. But again, these are, as Scott pointed out, you can overanalyze this. So, but if you wanted to read an undisputed pillar letter, start with Romans. At least in my opinion, okay? And then, yes, Scott.
Just another one, really quickly. It's sort of fun when you think about these things, and that is that a lot of times these letters, they sound too much like Paul. Okay. For example, and you do this yourself. If you wanted to sound like somebody who always used like, okay, or awesome, you throw in like awesome all over the place. Where in reality, if you analyze the speech of that person who uses like and awesome, they don't use it that much. Right.
So is there too much proof? Right. So yeah, this is interesting stuff. At least I think it's interesting. So it's second source. We talked about this, the Acts, right? And so Acts is the second letter by the author of the Gospel of Luke, right? It was called the History of the Church originally, supposedly, part 2. And he appears in Acts 7:58. And again, in order to confuse the opponents, he's first called Saul, and then his name changes from Saul to Paul in the second half. And basically from the second half of the book on, he's the central human actor. Now, again, the scholars are split. Is Acts a good historical record? Was it written by Luke the physician, the traveling companion of Paul? And others disagree, which is the great part about Bible study. Somebody always disagrees with somebody else. So here's some of the issues that in the book of Acts, the author only refers to Paul as an apostle once, and the author normally limits the name of apostle to the 12, as we would call them, right? And I thought apostles and disciples were the same thing, but sometimes when you start reading the letters of Paul, he calls himself an apostle almost every single chance that he gets in his letters, or the letters attributed to Paul. These are some other issues between the book of Acts and Paul's letter. How many times Paul went to Jerusalem? Who did he meet with? Right? So he, in Paul's letters in Galatians, he saw Peter and James. That's it. The one that troubles me the most personally is that in Acts, you get the idea that Paul is an eloquent speaker, right? He especially is in very difficult circumstances. I think it's always tough to be a persuasive speaker in a hostile audience, right? I used to give the rules meeting to coaches who were forced to be there, which is not a happy audience, right? So whenever people are forced to listen to you, that's tough. So he went to the Judeans in the synagogue and spoke to them. He spoke to the philosophers in Athens, and from what the historians tell us, rhetoric was like the NFL in the ancient Greek days, right? People would go and hey, let's argue with this guy, or let's argue with this one who is going to speak today. In Paul's own letters, though, he seems to downplay his speaking ability. And he even says that people think I'm not a strong speaker in 2 Corinthians 10:10. So we have kind of a dichotomy there, right? The eloquent, persuasive speaker in front of hostile audiences, and then someone who's not too good. In Acts, Paul is portrayed as performing healings and exorcisms. And this is my favorite as a person who makes presentations. The young man fell asleep listening to Paul and fell out the window and was killed, right? Or was taken for dead, right? But Paul doesn't seem to talk about that in his own letters. And this, to me, there's no mention of Paul's letters by the author of Acts. There's never any mention. And when you look at all the letters Paul wrote, you might think that's unusual, that there would be no mention of that. So there's these differences. Paul avoids saying that Christ died for humanity in Acts, but the crucial event in Jesus's life, according to the letters, is that he died for humanity. Luke, or I should say, in the Gospel of Luke and in Acts, the death of Jesus is a miscarriage of justice, right? He didn't do anything wrong. He executed an innocent man. But Paul's letters tend to say that the death and resurrection of Jesus was the salvation event. Others, the dietary laws, right? Not eating the meat sacrificed to idols. He in Galatians and Corinthians says that that's not important, and refuses to have the Gentile believers follow those laws. The we sections, they call it, we switch from first person singular or first person or third person singular, I or he or she, we all of a sudden in Acts, if you're reading Acts, all of a sudden it switches to we, first person singular, right? We did this, we did that. So some people are saying that the author of Acts was with Paul. So that's how Acts knows about Paul, and therefore Acts is extremely accurate. The other side is that the author of Acts somehow got Paul's travel diary and used that, and that's what the we portions are actual excerpts from Paul's travel diary. So it doesn't mean that the author of Acts knew anything about Paul or is it ever with Paul, but instead just as it says in Acts, meant to do a thorough history of the church. So things to think about. So what to do? This is the traditional method of Bible study. Use Acts as a chief source. This is the more modern approach, right? The letters as the only source. Now, Dr. Taylor says that we should use the letters as the chief source, kind of a different approach. But again, whichever one you use, look at Acts. It's very important in the history of the church, and look at Paul's letters because they're very crucial to our New Testament. Okay, so that's my 2 cents on Bible study. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Mike, do we have time for a couple of questions?
Yeah, that's what.
Okay. Any questions? I have a question, but I'll hold back and give other folks an opportunity. All right. Well, let me try to prime the pump.
Okay.
At the college, in part because of the kinds of families that many of our students, although not all, but many of our students come from, I would encounter students who would be extremely reluctant to do exactly the good work that we've done this morning. And they would be desperate, I think, to preserve what they would take to be the holiness of the Bible, and therefore almost be afraid to think too hard about the scripture, except to sort of defend the words on the page. What do you say to them to reassure them that this is an enterprise worth undertaking, not to undermine the faith, but to enrich it?
Well, here's my own. I always look at the levels of meaning from that midrash. We talked about that last week. And to me, people always want to skip the first part. You know, what's the plain meaning? And I always, well, I don't know the plain meaning because I haven't read it. And when I mean read, I mean read. I don't mean skim over. You know, I always pick on my mom's Bible study. I said, well, what did you guys do this week? We did the book of Isaiah. I said, really? And how long was that? Oh, 30 minutes. You know, and I'm like, what? You can't, even if you're one of those infomercials, you know, not legal and all, you know, and they do that. You couldn't do Isaiah in 30 minutes if you did that. So to me, first of all, let's go over the plain meaning. What does it say? And then we do the deeper meaning, you know, maybe using these approaches. But I always think it's a disservice to just say, I believe in the Bible and then not read it. I mean, that to me, you have to know what it says first, right? It's like I'm going to be a football official. I don't know any of the rules. I mean, you can't do that. At least I can't do that. So to me, I say, you know, and again, I think the start is this is the canon, right? So all of these, whether they're written by Paul or not, they're in our New Testament. When you open the Bible, you're going to see Titus and Timothy, right? And so it's stuff to learn. But to me, this is not saying, if I say, you know, what does it mean to be a slave of Jesus? I want to know that, right? I think that's important. What does Paul mean by that? Just to say I'm a slave of Jesus, I think you need to know what that is. So that's my take. That this is not saying that this is not part of our faith. This is saying that it's foundational to know what the words say. Scott.
Also, one of Bart Ehrman talks about, he's big into the biblical, what's called the critical method or literary criticism, I think. Gosh darn it. Textual criticism. That's it. Textual criticism, which means, what words really are in the Bible. And you see this a lot, some manuscripts include such and such. Right. And so these people get together to decide, I think that these are good and these aren't, and so on. And I am surprised that, as John pointed out, it seems like people who are this should be the first thing, deciding what words really are there, first of all. And this isn't, there was a guy who when they first came up with the Greek thing, Erasmus did his thing, right, with his 12 translations and so on, or his 12, doesn't matter. The point is, this guy went and he started cataloging the differences between the manuscripts that he was going to do over the summer. Okay. Well, years later, he had this catalog of 50 out of like a dozen manuscripts that they had at the time. He had like 50,000 discrepancies, differences between the two manuscripts. Okay. And they hated him.
Right. Because it's
like,
people don't want to know. They don't want to question. And I think that's really wrong. That's not being faithful. That's being ignorant, at least in my own humble opinion. You raising your hand, or you telling me it's time to go?
Oh no, I'll never tell you when it's time to go. One of the things that I'm thinking about is the answer to your question is, what do we say to your original question? What do we say to people who say, yeah, just got Isaiah in 30 minutes? I think we say the same thing to them that we also say to ourselves, and should always be saying something that Bonhoeffer encouraged is, who is, in light of all of this, after we read all of this, after we research all of this, what we really, how we benefit, I think, is to always be examining who is Christ now? Who is Christ to us here and now? Where do we see all of this in our lives today, in our development as Christians now?
Right. That's the important question to me. I always say at Bible study, what is this telling us? Not what is this telling, Hebrews 2,000 years ago, or the people who were persecuted by Nero, in the first century. What is this telling us? And I think that's important. But I think, first of all, you have to know what it's saying, and that's not easy. That's some, at least to me, that's all some interesting stuff that's going on.
I think the context applies to eternity.
Right. Yeah.
We get to know what it meant then. What was the setting? Just the examination of what a slave was. I mean, the paradox of, as a slave of Christ, being free in that society, because one is saying who you're not a slave of, as opposed to there's a triple thing going on there.
Yeah. And there's so many levels. It's just levels of importance.
Once we understand that, and then we can bring it forward and plug it into our hearts and say, and what am I a slave to?
Yeah, exactly.
Or not.
Yes. I always think it's interesting, the architecture, thinking about this, in St. Stephen's, you look at the, everybody knows the window of St. Paul is over on the right-hand side, and it's Paul because he's, as Betty pointed out, he's a Roman citizen, so he was not crucified when he was executed. he was beheaded with a sword. So he's standing there with a sword, just like that first slide there had the sword. So if you see somebody with a beard holding a book and a sword, it's normally Paul in iconography. Well, I said this to Churchill once, and he kind of shuddered, but I think Paul, if you look at St. Stephen's, Paul's eyes are toward the back of the church, and he's staring at, anybody? What window is he staring at? At least
That Jesus, that the one of Jesus in the back?
No, I think he's staring at the one of St. Stephen. And remember, in Acts, our introduction to Paul Saul is him holding the coats when Stephen is being stoned. And I think he's apologizing. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but but I think he's
He was looking at the treasurer.
Say again?
I thought he was looking at the treasurer, Mike.
Yeah, where's my money? Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe I read too much into that, but yeah, if you see the sword, if you go to London and you go around pubs, you'll see the City of London pub or something else, or City of London, and it's got the shield, right, with the red cross of St. George for England, but then it's got, if you're in the City of London, you'll see a red sword on the upper, what in heraldry would be the upper right, to us looks like the upper left of the shield, and that's the sword of St. Paul, who's the patron saint of London. So that's why there's a red sword on the London coat of arms.
This sounds like a Rorschach test. We take out of it, we bring into it,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I hate to bring this to a close, but I want to be respectful of the time and things, other events at the church, I think, online that are about to start before too long. But first of all, great thanks to Mike for such a stimulating discussion and really interesting discussion. So thank you. Next week, Melina Desbod, who's one of the seminarians for St. Stephen's, is going to do a presentation on the Imago Dei, so the image of God. And then the week after that, Megan Yost, who's also one of our co-parishioners and a prophet Dickinson, is going to talk about gender in God. And so this will be the first couple of installments of what I hope to be a Lenten series on our ideas about God. So that's what's in the offing. So thanks everybody for coming out, and we'll see you next week, if not before.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you.